You're kicking off the weekend with the Spill Sports Show. Listen every Friday on KRNU2 or 24/7 on thespillkrnu.wordpress.com.
We are talking about people that play games for money.
I love to bring a Jersey Shore type feel.
That makes me angry. That makes me sad. That gets me fired up.
Here's your hosts, Matt Reynoldson, David Eickholt, and Scott Ayers.
Welcome back. You're listening to the Spill Sports Show here on KRNU2. Matt Reynoldson, David Eickholt, and Scott Ayers with you. And right now, we have national do-it-all broadcaster from right here in Nebraska, Kevin Kugler. Kevin, it's great to finally talk to you.
Oh, it's good to be on with you. Thanks for having me.
So, we know you've run the gamut from Big Red Wrap-Up to the Masters, and we're all golf fans right here. So before we get into anything else, what was it like at Augusta National?
Well, it's always a real treat, and it's really one of the highlights of my year. You get done with the Final Four, and you've gone through a winter where you've been traveling through the Big Ten and the Big East, and it's cold and gray and kind of bleak, and you get down to Augusta National. It's just this explosion of color, really, before anything else across the country has started to bloom, it would seem. You've got all of the colors of the azaleas, and the trees are all in full leaf, and that's the first thing that greets you when you get to Augusta National. It's just that it is an explosion of color, and for those of us coming out of the Midwest where that color really hasn't set in yet, that's the first thing that always strikes me. And then, of course, you get down there, and it's different than any sporting event really anywhere because they control so much of what goes on. There are no cell phones, so no one is walking around looking at their phone, running into walls, running into other people. It's sort of like an event from the old days, really, where everybody's sitting around, drinking a cheap drink, eating a cheap sandwich, and watching some golf. And honestly, I love it. I love everything about that. It is so nice to occasionally get back to kind of the way things were before we all were obsessed with walking around with our phones and looking down at them and sending out tweets and Facebook messages and texting everybody. It's kind of a nice change, and of course it's great golf, so you get the chance to see the world's best in one of the best settings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like how you said it occasionally because I love my Twitter and I love my technology. But yeah, you said you touched on the Final Four. You did the play-by-play for the national championship this year, right?
Yes, correct.
What was that atmosphere like? That must have been just unbelievable.
Well, anytime you have it in these big arenas, which they've gone to over the last several years, you've become accustomed to big crowds and big excitement, and certainly you have that in every Final Four. We were a little subdued going into that national championship game because how miserable the games were in the semifinals. Mm-hmm. And we've all forgotten a little bit about how bad those games were because the national championship game was so good. But, you walked into that arena on Monday and you were just kind of hoping that it was going to be a good game. You didn't really expect it to be a good game. You were just going, please, don't give me another one like we had last week. That was terrible on Saturday night. That was terrible. And sure enough, we got one for the ages, and the atmosphere really matched the game. As the crowd continued to get into it, the game got better and better, and the crowd got louder and louder. It really just kind of fed upon itself. It was a fantastic atmosphere, capped by one of the great championship games we've ever seen.
Explain the moment of how you prepare yourself for the moment of calling a buzzer-beating game winner.
Well, you really don't prepare yourself for that. I mean, you go into every game hoping you have the chance to call a play like that or a moment like that and that you are up to the call. But you can't really sit there and, script out, okay, now if he does this, I'm going to say this or this or this. You just kind of have to hope that you're prepared enough for the game itself that when the moment comes, you're able to call that moment like you are really any other moment in any other sport. And, fortunately, we have a great crew. Everybody was ready. Everybody was on it. And we got the moment that we all kind of dream of when we go into these games. I could do 20 more Final Fours and never get another game like that.
Channeling your inner Gus Johnson for sure.
Now, Kevin, these chumps are asking you about all around the country, Augusta, NCAA basketball. you have been the voice of the College World Series here in Omaha for quite some time. Is there any extra significance being able to call those games in your hometown?
Well, there is something nice about that, and that's one of the reasons that I've been lucky enough and happy enough to stay involved in it as long as I have. It's one of those events that you go to as a kid, and you get the chance to see grow up in Omaha as you grow up a little bit. And I grew up in Lincoln, but, it's the same thing. You're watching this event up close because you're going to the games. I worked in Omaha all through college, so you'd go to the games then. And the event really has kind of grown up over the last 20 years, 25 years, like all of us have. And it's been fun to be a part of it as a broadcaster since 2003, and just really having the chance to be on some of the best calls of all time in college baseball. And as the sport continues to grow, that event is going to gain even more prominence. And I'm excited to see where it is 10 or 15 years from now, because I really do think with all of the regional networks that we have now and all the conference networks we have now, and the need for live programming, college baseball is still that one sport that's kind of an untapped, uncharted area for a lot of these networks. The SEC network and the Big Ten network have really gone full bore into doing baseball games this year, and I hope as it continues to grow, that will pay off and the sport just gets bigger and bigger.
You mentioned you're covering the NFL draft next weekend to me, and you've called Sunday night football games for 3 years. And so explain kind of what so you're around the NFL all the time. What's the hype surrounding this NFL draft, and what's the attitude like surrounding it, especially after all these late trades?
Well, I think it's a draft that has a lot of anticipation surrounding it, because we've already seen the draft has kind of gone a little nutty so far, and we haven't even gotten to the draft yet. So I think we all walk into this thing next week expecting to see a lot of movement from teams, maybe some more trades, hopefully some blockbusters. Those are always fun. You're going to see a lot of Ohio State folks go in the first round. You could see as many as 6 Buckeyes, in my opinion, go first round in this draft next week. And no surprise, Urban Meyer will be on hand in Chicago to probably pat each one of them on the head and remind them that he was an integral part of their success. And if they want to funnel a little back his way, he'd be more than happy to help out. But they are, it's going to be a huge Buckeye kind of first round in Chicago, and it's going to be a very interesting draft. Already with those trades, you've seen the shuffling. I hope we see more, because the trades are what make draft day fun. It's great to see somebody's name get called, but unless you have a real personal tie to that player, whether it be because you know the player or because you're a fan of his team or you're a fan of the team he's gone to, the draft can sometimes be a little stagnant as far as I'm concerned. But when you've got those blockbuster trades happening, that excitement can really jumpstart that thing. So I'm hoping we get to see a little bit of that action coming up next week again.
And so, we're talking about this first round and what it can bring to the table. And, some reporters have said that possibly 5 quarterbacks could be drafted in this first round. Are you buying into that? Do you truly believe that this draft class has 5 first-round capable quarterbacks?
I think if there are, you're stretching when you get to 4 or 5. That's just my opinion. I certainly don't consider myself a draft evaluator or a talent evaluator. But I look at this draft and I say, okay, who are your 5 quarterbacks that go in this draft? Is Connor Cook from Michigan State, is that a top first-round quarterback? And there are a lot of people saying, yeah, it very well could be a first-round quarterback. And I thought Connor Cook was a very, very solid quarterback over the years for Michigan State. But I don't know that I ever watched him, and I don't mean to pick on him, but I don't remember if I watched him and I said, that's a first-round guy right there.
Right, yeah.
That's where I struggle with this, because to the eye test for me, some of these guys don't pass that test as a first-round quarterback. But you look at the 2 guys we're talking about at the top of the draft in Goff and Wentz, and I've not seen enough of Wentz to be able to truly evaluate him, but I don't know that you'd consider Goff to be a first-round talent on the eye test, and obviously he's not going to be a first-round talent, he's going to be a first 2-pick talent.
Yeah. That's what's really surprising me, too. I agree with everything that you're saying. But another player I really want to touch on is, I had Jalen Smith in probably my top 3 picks. How far do you see him falling since he suffered that knee injury to end his career?
Well, I think that's going to be one of the real interesting things in this draft. You have to try to figure out exactly how much you believe from the pre-draft reporting. I'm healthy. I'm ready to go. I can do. He's going to fall some. The trades alone are going to force him to fall. it's going to be there are a couple of guys that I think are going to be very interesting to watch. He's one of them. Miles Jack is another guy to watch and see where he falls, if he falls at all. And they released a video showing him working out, saying, look, everything's fine with him. Don't worry about him. And another guy that I think is very interesting is Joey Bosa. This is a very talented player, but I am also not convinced that there's not a certain amount of bustability with him, because I'm not so sure he's not a man without a true position right now in the National Football League from a first-round standpoint. Is he a tackle? Is he an end? Is he a linebacker in a 4-3? Does he fit at any of those? I'm very interested to see where he goes as well, because that to me is another guy who could be drafted as high as 4 or 5, or could drop all the way down to the mid or late first round, depending on fit with a team.
Because of all the trades and the quarterback hype, I feel like over the past month, nobody's really even mentioned Bosa's name. So that will be an interesting storyline to watch this week.
Well, and I think he's a guy who has a lot of talent. I don't want to disparage him, but I will say this: it's all about, the draft is not about necessarily the talent you had as a collegiate player, but it's about how that talent that you have translates to a fit at the National Football League level. Whether you are a wonderfully talented guy, and he was a college terror, but where does he put that talent into play at the NFL level? And I've heard a lot of people talk about him as an outside linebacker in a 4-3 scheme, and I struggle with that a little bit. Does he have the speed, the lateral quickness that you need to play that position to a certain degree? I don't know. I'm anxious to see who takes him and where they translate him in their system, because that's going to be, to me, one of the real interesting sort of subplot storylines of this first round.
You're able to watch rookies and young guys develop quickly firsthand, and it seems like every draft is labeled year of this position. What position do you think this draft will end up being labeled?
Boy, well, if we have 5 quarterbacks in the first round, it's going to be the year of the quarterback. Or it could be the year of the reach quarterback if we have 5 of them in the first round. And to me, anything that happens in this draft outside of quarterback will be what it's labeled as if there's multiple positions. But right now, if there is really going to be a run on quarterbacks in this first round, then it's going to have to be the year of the quarterback. And I just don't see it match up to the other years of the quarterbacks that we've had in the national. The 1983 draft was a draft of quarterbacks where you had Marino and you had 5 quarterbacks then. Some were bust, some were not. I just don't know that this one matches up even to that level of quarterback taking. And you have to, that's the position of prominence in the National Football League. And if it is not that, then, I'm not sure what this one gets labeled as. The year of perhaps, you could say defensive line, but I don't know if that's the case. I'll stick with year of the quarterback if it does indeed pan out to be 5 quarterbacks taken.
I want to take the focus back local a little bit. You've done Big Red Wrap-Up now for a number of years, and you've obviously called Nebraska games on BTN. Explain the challenge of calling a game for a team that you're so focused on other parts of the week, going on Saturday and calling a game and having to be completely neutral.
Well, people ask me that all the time, and it really is not that hard, because at one point or another, you decide where your allegiance lies. Does my allegiance lie with a team that I went to school with, or does my allegiance lie with the person who's signing my paycheck? And 100% of the time, you've really got to decide, okay, my allegiance is with the team or the person that's signing my paycheck. If I'm Greg Sharp and I'm broadcasting for the Huskers, you're darn right you're going to know that I'm excited that the Huskers do this or the Huskers do that, because that's my job. But if I'm the guy who's doing the game on BTN or ABC or wherever, and it's Nebraska playing whoever, to me it's 2 teams playing. Look, we all went somewhere. Everybody in this business went somewhere. But that was a long time ago for me. You're talking 22 years since I graduated from the University of Nebraska. And while I still am a fan of this state and I call it home, I am not somebody when I get onto the broadcast that I'm going to be waving the towel for any team. I like a lot of different coaches and a lot of different players across the college landscape, but I'm not going to be waving the towel for any of them during a broadcast.
What's been your decision to I can imagine there's been some thoughts in your mind about maybe leaving Big Red Wrap-Up at one point. Why have you stayed there so long? What's been your motivation to stay with that program?
Well, it's one of my it's where I started, so to speak, from the standpoint of doing local and weekly television. So from that standpoint, there's a bit of a nostalgia involved in it. I enjoy doing the show, so I still do it from that standpoint. It helps, honestly, keep me in touch with what's going on both at the Nebraska level and across the Big Ten. I'm pretty well versed in Big Ten stuff these days, and because that's what I do most of the time. And so that's an easy prep for me. I don't have to spend a whole lot of extra time prepping for Nebraska because I've already prepped for Nebraska for most of the time. So, I know the Big Ten. I can provide a little bit of a perspective from across the league on the conference when I do the show. And, it's been a large part of my life for a long time. So I'll keep doing it as long as they'll have me.
All right. And Kevin, the question that everyone wants to know from you, how good will Nebraska be this season? What do you think our record ends off with?
Well, there are certainly a lot of questions that you have to answer going into this year, and I think one of them is, what will we see from Nebraska offensively? I mean, you look at this program at the end of the year, and you like what you saw from a running game standpoint, but will Nebraska be willing to commit to that on a regular basis? We've heard a lot of good things from Coach Langsdorff and Coach Riley in the spring, and I think if you're a Nebraska fan, you always walk into a season with a little bit of optimism. But I think the biggest optimism right now comes from the recruiting standpoint of Nebraska, not necessarily the immediate future on the field. You look at the schedule, there are several pivotal games. I think if you are a realistic person, you hate to set benchmarks, this or bust, but this feels like a 7 or 8 win season for Nebraska. And with the schedule they have, especially front-loaded early where they can gain some confidence and some wins early in the conference season, or they should be favored to get some confidence and some wins early in the conference season, you have to look at this and say, okay, a 7 or 8 win season, then trying to build on that in the years to come with a bevy of talent and breaking in a brand new quarterback. I mean, next year is going to be fascinating in the spring because we'll really have a true quarterback battle in Lincoln, and that'll be the head. You talk about the year of the quarterback in the draft. 2017 is going to be the year of the quarterback at Nebraska football. In other words, who will it be? And I'm very anxious to see not only how Tommy Armstrong plays in his final year this year, but who starts to develop as that next guy going forward from Mike Riley.
A lot of intrigue surrounding the Nebraska football program. Kevin, before we let you go, I wanted to get this question in. What's the favorite sports moment you've ever called?
Well, it may have been that national championship game just a few weeks ago. I mean, that is one of the highlights of my career, having the chance to call that game. I will throw in another one though, because it is one that's kind of near and dear to my heart. When Nebraska baseball made the College World Series in 2005, and they were playing Arizona State in that classic game that Jeff Larish hit about 13 or 14 home runs, I think, that day against Nebraska. I was calling the game with Keith Moreland, who had been a guy I had looked up to as a Chicago Cub, big Cubs fan, and Keith Moreland had patrolled the outfield for several years in the 80s when the Cubs were actually a team that was good to talk about then, kind of like they are now, except not quite as good as they are now. And they and so I got to do the games with Keith Moreland, got to call that, and that Nebraska-Arizona State game is one of my favorite games to have called. Enjoyed working with him. He's terrific. Went on to become the voice of the Cubs for a while, and that game was fantastic drama and one of the best atmospheres I've ever been around in sport. It was a football crowd at a baseball game, and I loved every minute of it. That was a real treat.
We're just a couple months away from another maybe legendary few games in the College World Series of 2016. Kevin, thanks so much for coming on.
Hey, enjoyed it. Thanks, guys.
That's Kevin Kugler, national do-it-all broadcaster and alum of the University of Nebraska. Coming up next, we'll talk a little bit of Conor McGregor in UFC and the Jordan Stevenson Tweet of the Week. Stay with us. This is the Spill Sports Show.
The Spill Sports Show with Matt Reynoldson, David Eickholt, and Scott Ayers. Never miss a show again. Check out our podcast at thespillkrnu.wordpress.com.
The 76ers could have drastically improved their organization by drafting Walter Pitchford.
Quite frankly, if he wins a Super Bowl, I'll direct it 30 for 30 on it.
I've watched this kid play multiple times on national television.
You like watching kids, David?
Dude, I love basketball. Excuse me.
The Spill Sports Show, every Friday from 1 to 3 on KRNU2.